A drunk tourist wobbled up to a royal guard outside a famed English palace, hurled slurred insults, and spat on his gleaming helmet. The crowd held its breath, but the guard's response left everyone speechless. Before we continue, share in the comments if you've ever seen someone remain calm under extreme disrespect, and if you appreciate these stories of dignity and honor, consider subscribing so you'll never miss one. On this brisk afternoon, the atmosphere around the palace was electric with the buzz of visitors. People streamed in from all directions, cameras dangling from their necks, children skipping about, and older couples taking in the grandeur. In the midst of this throng, a line of royal guards stood unmoving, dressed in immaculate red tunics, and bearing their tall fur-lined hats, icons of tradition. They had become the subject of countless photos, a symbol of British heritage. Each guard was trained for more than ceremony. They were soldiers first and foremost, each having served their country in various capacities. One of them, Corporal James Harper, had enlisted in the British Army at 19, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and eventually found himself entrusted with the duty of standing guard at the palace gates. The stoicism required by his post had been developed over years of discipline, and the role carried a weight that few outside the military truly understood. No matter the situation, no matter the provocation, these guards were expected to remain calm and professional, embodying centuries of refined decorum. Tourists often tested these limits. Some tried making funny faces just inches away. Others told jokes to coax a reaction, and a few, driven by bravado, attempted more outlandish stunts to see if they could make the guard flinch. Even so, James, with his chiseled features, sharp eyes and unwavering posture, had grown accustomed to such provocations. He had endured them with a kind of grace that came from understanding his duty was not just about him, but about representing the dignity and history of an entire country. This afternoon, the air felt slightly heavier than usual, as though something was about to happen. James stood still, gazing straight ahead, but maintaining that subtle awareness of his surroundings. He could see, from the corner of his eye, a man stumbling slightly, his voice louder than the rest, his swagger permeated with a sense of drunken confidence. This was Derek, a tourist evidently flush with money and entitlement, who had spent the day celebrating a bit too hard. He had come from the nearby pubs, already reeking of alcohol and shouting over the voices of other visitors. His friends hung back, giggling and encouraging him to approach the guards, all in the spirit of capturing some wild footage to share online. Derek was not content with just a quick snapshot or a silly face. There was something in his swagger that suggested a hunger for a deeper form of attention. Perhaps he wanted to show off in front of his group, or maybe his arrogance sprang from a place of profound insecurity. Either way, the moment he laid eyes on Corporal Harper, it became clear that Derek was looking for trouble. James, for his part, felt his senses sharpen the moment he noticed Derek's approach. He sensed the tension that came when someone stepped forward with disrespect in mind. Yet he maintained his composure, eyes forward, posture rigid. On the fringes of the crowd, parents ushered their children along, some stopping to watch what they presumed might be another small attempt to provoke the silent guard. A few older folks, possibly military veterans themselves, stiffened instinctively, recalling their own training in the face of unruly civilians. Derek drew closer, brandishing a grin that revealed a confidence he had no right to feel. Some tourists chuckled nervously, and cameras angled for a better shot. Even though no one knew precisely what he'd do, there was a sense that it wouldn't be pretty. Derek initially began with the typical attempts, waving his hand inches from James's face, speaking loud enough for the crowd to hear, mocking the uniform and calling the guard a toy soldier. James neither blinked nor responded. He had been through this sort of mockery many times, and it never affected him personally. Over the years, he had internalized a simple but powerful mantra: Their words can't compromise my integrity. His job, above all else, was to maintain a certain dignity that no passing insult could tarnish. And yet there was a weight in the air that afternoon hinting that Derek's behavior would escalate beyond silly gestures. A hush fell over parts of the crowd as Derek stumbled slightly closer, his eyes glassy with drink, and began hurling personal insults. He made jabs about James's family, about the obsolete monarchy, and about the guards' supposed lack of intelligence for just standing there. Little by little, the tension ramped up, and what had started as an obnoxious spectacle was beginning to feel more like a brewing confrontation. As the minutes passed, the circle of onlookers widened, creating a hollow ring where Derek stood just a foot or two away from James's stoic form. Even some of Derek's friends started looking uneasy. One of them mumbled that they should head out, that this was getting out of hand, but Derek shrugged him off with an arrogant smirk. It was in that moment that Derek leaned in and whispered something vile and profane about the uniform and the guard's role. James could almost feel the heat of the man's breath through the crisp London air, but James stayed silent, focusing on the training that had seen him through worse conditions on the battlefield. Honor, discipline, and self-restraint were not just words for him, they were etched into his very being. Yet the worst was still to come, as Derek seemed to feed off the tension in the atmosphere, determined to push the boundaries further than anyone could have expected. The watchers could sense that Derek wasn't satisfied with the guards' non-reaction. He wanted to crack that composure, to prove that even this paragon of British discipline could be humiliated. Derek swayed on his feet, glancing around to see that almost everyone's eyes were on him. Emboldened by the twisted encouragement of a few chuckles and the silent filming of smartphone cameras, he decided to take his mockery to another level. He pretended to trip forward, bumping the edge of James's shoulder. It wasn't a forceful hit, but enough to be an invasion of personal space. Some spectators gasped. Any form of physical contact with a guard can carry consequences, though it's more often the guard who is authorized to respond. James still remained calm, or at least he showed no visible sign of anger. Beneath that stoic facade, though, a sense of disquiet began to simmer. He remembered his fellow soldiers lost in combat, the reason he wore this uniform with such pride. He also remembered the countless times people had tried and failed to degrade him. Every muscle in his body urged him to remain steadfast, because to respond violently would be to give Derek what he wanted. The scenario might have ended right there had Derek stopped, but the crowd's reaction seemed to fuel him to go further. Nearby, a couple of young children clung to their parents, watching with wide eyes. An older man, wearing a cap embroidered with a service branch insignia, shook his head, his own hands curling into fists at the sight of a soldier being disrespected so publicly. Derek stumbled back, letting out a mocking laugh. He made a grand show of wiping the shoulders of his own expensive coat, as though the very air around the guard had sullied it. Then he hurled a final slur about how these guards were just props for tourists, and the monarchy was nothing but an outdated relic. Tension hung heavy, and a foreboding silence settled around the group of onlookers. James felt the tautness in his spine, the discipline that had been drilled into him calling for calm. He drew in a measured breath, exhaled slowly, and once again focused his gaze straight ahead, reaffirming his vow not to be baited by the likes of Derek. But Derek's eyes gleamed with a drunken malice. He was enjoying this too much, and it was clear that he wanted to see James break protocol. Another wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers as Derek advanced. He leaned in so close that James could smell the bitter tang of alcohol on his breath. Finally, in a shocking display that many would later describe as a moment where time seemed to slow, Derek spat, launching a thick glob of saliva that landed directly on the polished surface of James's helmet. A gasp spread through. The crowd and even the wind seemed to hush in dismay. Smartphones that had been pointing away snapped back to attention, capturing the scene in sharp detail. Some spectators covered their mouths in shock, while others audibly cursed. Derek's friends went silent, clearly not having anticipated that he would go this far. Spitting on a soldier, on any person, was an act of raw disrespect. The crowd expected James to explode, or at least to march forward and deal out immediate retribution. But James remained rigid, though his breath caught for just a second. His mind raced, swirling with the weight of this insult. In the chaos of his thoughts, one notion rose above the rest. He represented more than himself. He represented the sacrifices of his comrades, the tradition of the crown, and the centuries of service that his uniform symbolized. If he lashed out, it would stain not just him, but the legacy he served. So he stood there, letting that moment of shock permeate the crowd, until finally, with a deliberate slowness, he raised one gloved hand to the side of his helmet and wiped the saliva away. His posture never wavered. His eyes never left the horizon. It was as though that single quiet motion spoke volumes about who he was and what he stood for. The tension in the air was suffocating, and people in the crowd found themselves on edge, waiting to see if Derek would try something else, or if James would break character and confront him. But Derek, still lost in his intoxicated bravado, smirked, half expecting to see rage in the guard's eyes. Instead, he saw only calm determination. When James finally moved, it was unexpected. He pivoted just enough to face Derek, a small break in protocol, but one that was warranted by the extremity of the insult. He locked eyes with the tourist. Though he spoke quietly, every word was crystal clear in the hush that had fallen over the courtyard. The crowd leaned in, straining to hear what the guard had to say. James's voice was resonant and steady, like a deep bell tolling in the cold air. He said, "You think your mockery makes me weak, that my silence is a sign I'm beneath you. But let me tell you something. This uniform I wear, it's not just a costume. It represents every soldier who stood in harm's way, so you could stand here and do as you please. This helmet you spat on, it honors the memory of those who never returned home." His eyes never broke contact with Derek, and his tone remained calm, devoid of anger, yet carrying a tremendous weight. "I don't respond because I fear you," he continued. "I remain silent because I serve something larger than myself. I serve a tradition of dignity and discipline. Your insults are only words, and your spit is only water. Neither can tarnish what this uniform means. You can carry on with your mockery, or you can reflect on what real strength is. It's not in raising your voice or striking a blow, it's in standing firm for what you believe in." The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. At that moment, James's words cut through every trivial thought. Children, who moments ago might have giggled at Derek's antics, now looked up in wide-eyed awe, learning a lesson in respect and courage right before their eyes. Veterans in the crowd stood a little straighter, some perhaps recalling their own service, tears welling in their eyes. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter. Even those who had been amused by Derek's performance moments earlier now wore sober expressions. Derek, on the other hand, stood there blinking, his mouth slightly open as though his mind had short-circuited. He'd expected an outburst, a violent reaction, anything that would have made him feel powerful. Instead, he was confronted with the unshakable integrity of a man who'd faced real battles, who carried real burdens, and who refused to engage in a petty spat. Something in Derek's gaze changed, as though a weight were finally settling on his chest. He started to stammer, maybe to laugh it off as if it were all a big joke, but no sound came. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded video. The hush in the air seemed to vibrate with the significance of this standoff. Finally, Derek glanced around at the onlookers. Instead of the approval he might have hoped to see, he found contempt, disappointment, and disbelief. A few onlookers shook their heads in disgust. Some even told him to leave, their voices no longer passive but commanding. One of Derek's friends nudged him, whispering harshly that they'd better get out of there. But it was already too late for a graceful exit. Palace security, alerted by the commotion, had started to converge. A couple of uniformed police officers, who stood watch around the palace, noticed the confrontation and approached. For Derek, who moments before had played the cocky antagonist, the shift in atmosphere was overwhelming. His cheeks burned with shame, and he looked like a man just realizing the enormity of what he'd done. The tension deflated somewhat as security stepped in, asking Derek to move back. Some in the crowd began murmuring about pressing charges, about how spitting on an officer or soldier could be considered assault. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come out as confidently as before. His drunken bravado drained away, replaced by a cold sweat of realization. In that moment, Derek seemed to shrink as two officers separated him from James, who had already resumed his statue-like stance. The guard didn't move a muscle, nor did he say anything further. The measured response had been delivered. The statement had been made. What more needed to be said? The crowd remained still, watching the scene unfold. Derek stumbled over his own words as an officer asked for identification. He tried to explain, slurring that it was just a joke, that he'd had a few drinks, that he hadn't meant any harm. But the spit on James's helmet had been undeniable. Some members of the crowd, emboldened by James's calm, began voicing their opinions. He should be fined. You disrespected a soldier. Have some shame. The police officers, handling the situation with professional calm, took Derek aside, presumably to issue a citation or possibly detain him for a short period. The rest of the tourists looked on as Derek's inflated ego collapsed like a balloon pricked by a needle. His cheeks reddened further, and he refused to meet anyone's gaze. It was a stark contrast to the swagger he had shown just moments earlier. Meanwhile, Corporal Harper faced forward again, his helmet free of spit, though faintly smeared from where he had wiped it clean. The subtle tension in his posture lessened, but he maintained the composure he was trained to uphold. For him, this was part of his duty, a living testament to self-restraint and discipline. A wave of subtle applause began within the crowd, almost hesitant at first. Then it grew, scattered claps merging into a show of appreciation for the guard's unwavering integrity. James, of course, did not react to the applause. He merely continued with his post, letting the moment speak for itself. The crowd eventually began to disperse, many wearing contemplative expressions. Some had filmed the entire incident, and those videos, capturing Derek's vile act and James's dignified response, quickly made their way onto social media platforms. People around the world would later see the short clip of a drunken tourist spitting on a royal guard, and the guard's eloquent, composed words that followed. But in the moment, there at the palace gates, the moral of the story was already taking shape in the minds of every witness. Respect isn't demanded by force. It is earned through courage and principle. Derek, escorted away by the officers, might have sobered up rapidly in the aftermath. His friends lingered awkwardly, some filming him with uneasy laughter, uncertain how to handle the sudden shift from comedic spectacle to moral reckoning. And so the courtyard returned to its usual rhythms, with the flow of tourists resuming and a new guardsman soon rotating in to relieve James at the end of his watch. Yet something had changed, a sense of collective understanding that a deeper lesson had been taught. People whispered about the event as they wandered away, remarking on how calm the guard had been, how humiliating it must have felt to suffer that insult in front of so many, yet still remain the bigger man. More than a few commented that they had never seen such a vivid example of composure triumphing over sheer arrogance. Over the next few days, the story gained traction online. The video clip circulated through countless social media feeds and news outlets. Comment sections filled with praise for James's restraint, condemning Derek's behavior and celebrating the guard's message. The viral footage reached veterans groups, community forums, and even international audiences who found it inspiring to see such a blatant display of dignity in action. People pointed out that it wasn't just about British tradition, but a universal theme, staying true to one's principles in the face of blatant disrespect. It served as a reminder that sometimes silence and a well-chosen word can topple the loudest bullies. Headlines appeared in various publications discussing the incident, not focusing so much on Derek's drunken behavior, but on James's calm, measured speech. Editorials praised the guard for demonstrating a kind of moral fortitude that many felt was missing in a world dominated by viral outrage and heated confrontation. Interview requests poured into the military office overseeing the guards, though most were politely declined as the regiment preferred to keep its personnel out of the limelight. A short official statement emphasized that the duty of a royal guard was to uphold tradition with dignity, and that Corporal Harper had simply done his duty. That understatement only fueled more admiration from the public. People began visiting the palace with a new sense of respect. Parents, holding their children's hands, would point to the guards and quietly recount the story of Corporal Harper's composure. Teachers used the viral video in classrooms, teaching lessons about respect for authority, empathy, and the consequences of one's actions. Many veterans resonated deeply with the story, seeing in James's stoic response the embodiment of what they had been taught in the service: discipline, respect, and the courage to stand up for a cause bigger than oneself. They lauded him for maintaining composure, echoing that the real measure of a soldier's strength is not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life as well. Some older veterans even took trips to the palace specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of James and, if protocol permitted, shake his hand. They rarely succeeded in identifying him for certain. Most guards looked uniform at a glance, but the gesture was a testament to the impact of his actions. Even the tourists who were there that day felt compelled to share their eyewitness accounts, describing in detail the hush that fell over the crowd, the raw tension, and the powerful wave of respect that followed James's words. They insisted that what the video showed was only a piece of the emotional significance the event held in person. For Derek, the aftermath was harsher than a fine or a reprimand. He became something of an online pariah. Once the footage was shared, his face appeared in memes, compilations of shameful tourist behavior, and discussions about entitlement. He tried issuing an apology statement through his social media, claiming that he was intoxicated and hadn't realized what he was doing, but the damage was done. He lost business associates who saw the clip and distanced themselves, not wishing to be associated with a man whose disrespect went viral. The apology fell flat for many who saw it as insincere damage control. Friends or acquaintances of Derek, who had once laughed at his rowdy behavior, turned away, not wanting to be tainted by the same brush of public scorn. In the court of public opinion, Derek found no leniency, and in time, he either learned to live with that shame or to change for the better. Days turned into weeks, and the palace grounds continued their daily routines. Guards marched in timed ceremonial shifts. The changing of the guard played out with its usual pomp, and thousands of visitors continued to flood the space. Yet a subtle shift had taken hold. People treated the guards with a little more respect than before, or so it seemed. Where once tourists might have seen them purely as an attraction, now a certain reverence, fueled by the viral story, colored their perspective. Children looked up at them with wide-eyed wonder, not just because of the bright uniforms, but because they realized these were real soldiers of integrity. Press inquiries kept pouring in, though James himself stayed away from public interviews. Some journalists tried to capture candid shots or to approach him off-duty. A few stories emerged of attempts to get him to comment, but James politely refused. He had made his statement there in the courtyard, in front of that crowd. It wasn't about fame or personal glory, it was about doing the right thing at the right time. Inside the barracks, some of his fellow guards teased him, calling him the philosopher in red. But they also respected him immensely for how he had upheld the regiment's honor. Senior officers commended his restraint, and rumors circulated that he might be in line for a commendation. James remained unruffled by the talk, simply fulfilling his duties as he always had. For him, the most valuable endorsement came from the young recruits who looked up to him. In quiet moments, some would approach, saluting him off-duty, wanting to shake his hand. They told him how they hoped they could display such composure if ever put in a similar position. James would only nod, reminding them that a soldier's discipline is lifelong. It's about being ready for whatever comes your way, even if it's something as unexpected as a drunk tourist. Meanwhile, families continued to share the video with children, and educators used it as a modern parable for moral behavior. Online forums lit up with debates about respect, tradition, and how to handle provocations. Discussions ranged from praising the guard's calm to criticizing Derek's sense of entitlement, to more philosophical questions about what respect for authority should look like in the modern age. In the broader public discourse, the story took on a life of its own, growing and transforming into a symbol of what it means to stand for something. People from various backgrounds, cultural, political, social, found common ground in appreciating James's measured response. It became a reference point. Remember the royal guard who kept his cool when he was spat on? And when confronted with daily challenges or petty conflicts, some individuals privately recalled that moment, choosing to respond with calm instead of aggression. Over time, it evolved into something like a folk tale, passed around in discussions of character and integrity. On a crisp morning, weeks after the incident, Corporal James Harper stood at the same post, the sunlight gleaming off his helmet. The crowd was its usual mixture of wide-eyed tourists, local passers-by, and officials keeping order. While many in the crowd had no idea who James was or the events that had transpired, a few recognized him. They whispered among themselves, pointing gently, speculating if this was indeed the same guard who had handled that infamous drunk tourist with such dignity. Among the curious was a young boy, no more than 7, clinging to his mother's hand. He looked up at James with big, inquisitive eyes, clearly in awe of the tall figure in red and black. The mother nudged the boy forward. He tentatively stepped up, gave a timid salute, and smiled shyly before stepping back. James, adhering to protocol, did not move, but inside he felt an unmistakable warmth. Moments like these reminded him that the uniform he wore meant hope, respect, and honor to many people. The mother mouthed "thank you" in James's direction, perhaps recalling or having heard of the story. James remained quiet, doing his duty, letting the moment pass as it always did. A little later, an elderly man limped by on a cane, wearing an old regimental beret. He paused to look at James, giving him a slight nod and a respectful salute. This gesture carried a private understanding, one veteran to another, an affirmation of shared values. James nodded his head in the barest of acknowledgments, well aware that the cameras around might miss that tiny gesture. But it mattered. It was a silent connection that said, "I see you, and I respect what you represent." As the day wore on, people came and went. Tourists marveled, cameras clicked, and the hum of conversation filled the air. That single day felt no different from any other for the majority of visitors, but an undercurrent of reverence lingered, amplified by the viral story of the guard who had refused to let a drunk tourist tarnish his pride. Hours later, James's Watch came to an end, and another guardsman took his place. James quietly stepped away from his post, maintaining that stiff, proud posture until he was out of the public eye. Once alone, he allowed himself the briefest moment to roll his shoulders, loosening the tension that came from long periods of stillness. The crisp London air felt invigorating against his face as he removed his helmet inside the guardroom, and though he didn't show it outwardly, there was a part of him that carried a sense of fulfillment, knowing that, in a world where noise often drowns out reason, he had stood firm for something important. He had turned an act of ugliness into a lesson in dignity. That day, and every day since, he chose to remember not the spitting or the insults, but the look on the faces of those children watching, and the silent salute of that old veteran. He recalled how the crowd, once hungry for confrontation, ended up learning a lesson in respect, and how the weight of that moment might ripple out in ways he'd never fully see. In the end, the story became more than just a viral clip or a tourist's bad behavior. It evolved into a collective reminder that true power does not come from dominating another person, nor from shouting the loudest, nor from lowering oneself to the level of the aggressor. Instead, it lies in understanding what is at stake: one's honor, one's principles, and the legacy one carries, and refusing to compromise that for momentary retaliation. Through his silence, and then his measured words, James showed that real strength means walking the higher path, even, and perhaps especially, when you're provoked to show weakness. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, but the video continued to circulate online. In digital spaces, people from various corners of the globe discovered the clip, drawn in by the shocking thumbnail of a drunken tourist spitting at a royal guard. They clicked, expecting perhaps a confrontation, some dramatic brawl for entertainment. Instead, they found a calm refusal to engage in violence, a deliberate statement about respecting the sacrifices etched into a uniform. For many, it sparked introspection. They asked themselves how they might react in a similar situation, if they had the composure to maintain their dignity, or if they would lash out in anger. That quiet reflection was, in itself, a testament to the enduring power of James's moment of calm. By the time a year had passed, the incident had become something of a legend among the palace guards, with newcomers hearing about it like a rite of passage. The central figure himself, Corporal James Harper, remained unchanged at his core. He kept performing his duties, unwavering and dedicated, just as he had before the incident. If asked about that day, he would likely offer a simple response: "I was just doing my duty." And that was the truth. He didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't relish the spotlight or the praise. He simply believed that a soldier's greatest honor lies in serving with integrity, whether on the battlefield or standing guard at a palace gate in peacetime. And that, perhaps, was the ultimate moral of the story, that dignity is not a performance, but a state of being, one that comes from within, nurtured by discipline and an unbreakable moral compass. When confronted by ugliness or disrespect, you can either be consumed by it or transcend it. The day Derek spat on James's helmet, James chose transcendence, and that choice left a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. So the next time you see someone standing firm in their beliefs, refusing to engage in pettiness, remember Corporal Harper's words. Think of the soldier who stayed true to his duty while a drunken tourist tried to tear him down and failed. Ask yourself how you might react in that same situation. Would you respond with anger, or could you find the strength to stand tall in dignified silence? Let that question linger and guide you. If you believe in stories that champion respect and composure, share this with someone who needs that reminder today. And remember, true strength lies not in the fury of our reactions, but in the grace we show when put to the test.